Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday and today Tuesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on the website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. All right, this is a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C.-based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletters. If you'd like more information about that, you can send an email to this email, and we'll get back to you. All right, our speaker today is Kevin Pomfret. He's going to be covering due diligence of data assets and corporate transactions M&A. Thank you for joining us today, Kevin. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mallory, for having me speak on this issue. It's one that I think is going to be of growing importance as industry moves to big data and data becomes increasingly more valuable. Mallory, I don't have this. I'm not seeing the slides on my screen. Is that should I be seeing those? Yeah, so if you could do the next slide, please. Okay, so just from my perspective and why I think this is an important issue, I see data, you hear a lot of discussions around whether data is like oil or data is like the next gold or some other valuable asset. And I think those discussions, while interesting, are really, from a legal standpoint, less of issue. It's more is I see data as an asset of an organization, and that data can vary from personal information to data that's licensed from other parties to data that an organization creates. And so if you look at data like that, as a lawyer, you need to protect its value. Well, as an organization, you need to protect its value. An organization needs to think and protect it as much as it values and protects any other types of asset. And it also needs to minimize the associated operational legal risks that are generally available or generally arise with any asset. So if you look at it from that standpoint, it's important to understand what the legal and regulatory framework around data is, and then how do you protect its value and minimize the risk. And that's important in any corporate transaction, but particularly in an M&A transaction, because that value is something that the acquiring company is factoring in, or should be factoring in when it's acquiring it. Now, it may not show up on the books as having value, but from an organizational standpoint, it is important and will be increasingly important. So that's why I think this issue around due diligence around data in a transaction, an M&A transaction, is so important. Next slide, please, Mallory. So today I'm going to be talking about a few different issues. One is the things that most people think about when they're thinking about data, and that is privacy and data protection, and how you do due diligence associated with that in a corporate transaction. But also, I think it's important to understand what the ownership rights in data are in your organization or in the target company, and how that applies, whether it be the target company's data or data that it has licensed or acquired from a third party. And that might be from individuals, it might be from other organizations, it may be from government agencies. It really depends on the nature of the company, but increasingly organizations are collecting data from a variety of sources. Data quality and liability issues. As we start looking at making decisions in real time or near real time based on data, it's important to make sure that the data is of sufficient quality for those decision making, and that an organization has the processes and understanding of the data quality for the decision making that's being made. And this is increasingly an issue as decision making around data is being pushed further down into organizations who aren't necessarily, with individuals of those organizations, aren't necessarily data scientists and don't understand necessarily some of the aspects of data quality that are important. And finally, I'll touch on sort of at a high level the framework for due diligence and data assets from my perspective, and we'll go into that in more detail on the second half of this webinar. But I do want to sort of at a very high level discuss what those issues are. Next slide, please. So when you're doing due diligence around privacy and data protection, there are several different aspects that I think are important to keep in mind. One is simply the data protection and privacy policies that the organization has. Now, that can take several different forms, and it's important to keep that in mind. Some of those are the privacy policies that are on the organization's websites for third parties that are coming to visit the website or otherwise providing information to them. And it's important to take a look at those and, one, make sure they comply with applicable law. So, for instance, some of you probably know that the California Consumer Privacy Act takes effect this January, and it is going to, in the United States anyways, it will have a significant impact for companies that are collecting information from California consumers, what their privacy policies need to say. So you want to make sure that those privacy policies are up to date, and this is evolving not just in California, but other states as well. So that's one aspect to it. But then internally, what policies in place does the organization have with respect to data that they collect? Is there training? Is there guidance? And are they following the privacy policies that they have on their website? Because that's an area where people frequently will overlook. So those are part of the due diligence as well. I like to say that cybersecurity is the opposite side of the same coin with respect to data protection and privacy. That's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's a way to look at it. So to make sure that the cybersecurity policies that are in place in an organization are current, that the management understands what those are and why they've implemented them. That's again going to be increasingly important as states like California provide protection for for companies that have adequate cybersecurity measures in place. But it's also just good business practice to make sure that you have cybersecurity. So doing a deep dive into that is going to be increasingly important. And many of you are probably familiar with cases where people have acquired companies and subsequently found out that there had been a data breach and there was significant economic and litigation involved. And so the third part of this is making sure that you understand what litigation and regulatory matters that the target company is subject to. And that can require not just direct litigation, but do they have any reason to believe that perhaps they will be subject to mitigation or subject to litigation or some sort of regulatory enforcement action, both at the federal and the state level. It's important to make sure you capture both of those and to have meaningful discussions as to is there things that they could have done or should have done differently. So for instance, if they didn't report something to the Attorney General as they may have been as subject to certain state data breach laws, why they didn't do that, and make sure that you agree with their assessment as to why they didn't report. You don't want to take on a liability associated with that unnecessarily. And then the third part of that is third parties. So in this data ecosystem that's evolving as data is being transferred back and forth between organizations, whether it be your vendors or whether it be your customers, understanding what requirements you're imposing on them with respect to data protection and cybersecurity, and what protection that they're imposing on the target company as well. So if you're acquiring a company, you want to understand the full effect of what obligations they have in place and what obligations that they have to other parties. And that requires not just a quick review of contracts to make sure that they're enforceable, but going through the reps and warranties, the data protection, the cybersecurity aspects, and make sure that those are adequate, and frankly, that there's something that you can continue to do going forward, because you don't want to take on a risk or an obligation that you're not able to do. And some companies and some industries are further along than others, so understanding what that is very important. Next slide, please. So I mentioned data quality and liability, and I think this is going to be increasingly important, particularly as we start moving to the Internet of Things and AI and machine learning, where we have data that's going into these black boxes and decisions are being made, and the people don't necessarily understand how that decision is being made. So if you're acquiring a company that's in this field or will be in this field in the near future or developing technology in this area, it's important to understand how this works. One thing to consider is this a product or a service? If there's a product, if there's something that your target company is offering, because that will impact the level of or the type of data quality or liability issues that you may acquire. So, is there a service? Which was more on the negligence side? But if there's a product, is it a product liability? And there haven't been many cases in this area, unfortunately. So a deep dive is important to understand what the potential risk is and making sure that you can mitigate those, and that those have been built in again into the agreements that the acquiring company has with third parties, but then also internally if they've done all that they need to do. I put fit for purpose because it's important to make sure that the data is of sufficient quality for the purpose for which it's being used, if there are decisions being made or applications being developed. And that can be in terms of whether the data set is complete, whether it's accurate, whether it's precise, or whether it's current enough for the particular application. There's no easy answer to that because these will all vary, but you want to make sure that the organization has looked at this and understands that as they built their applications, and you're not acquiring any potential liability because the data isn't of sufficient quality. I put in here data finds a way. When I talk about this issue, I often mention that it's similar to a quote from Jurassic Park that's made about life finds a way. In this case, what I mean is that once data gets into an organization, it is my experience that it is often used by other parts of the organization for other purposes, which is great. Data can be very versatile, but just because it can be used for another application doesn't mean that it's of sufficient quality for that application. So understanding how the data was acquired and how it worked its way into the organization for decision making is going to be increasingly important. And so obviously, some of those decisions are of little risk, and some could be of significant risk. So you'll want to, allocate your resources accordingly as you're doing your due diligence. And then representations and warranties. Again, if your target company is acquiring data from third parties, what representations and warranties have they received with regard to data quality, if any? Are there any standards that they've applied? Is there a duty to update in terms of timeliness? And on the same side, if there are data products and services that are being provided to customers, what are the representations and warranties that the target company has made? And are those sufficient? And do you have confidence that those can be achieved? And if not, what do you need to mitigate those in your M&A transaction? Next slide, please. So something that I think is often overlooked is understanding rights in data and who owns them. And in many instances, particularly with personal data, there's an assumption that you get a right to use it, and the individuals don't own their data, and that's probably correct in most parts of the world. Although I would argue in some parts of that world that may be changing. But so when you're looking at data in organizations, and you're trying to understand where they get it from, a lot of times they'll collect it themselves, but other times they will license it from third parties, and you want to make sure that, one, the license that they have is adequate and gives the target company the rights that it needs to develop some products and services. You also want to make sure that how they use the data doesn't somehow violate the terms of the license going forward, or how their customers are going to use the data, and that requires some understanding of back-to-back licenses and how those are working together. I had an example once where a client had obtained rights to use data for certain phishing applications, but was actually licensing the data to third parties for other phishing applications. And so that's the type of thing that isn't necessarily looked at, because the customer license was several years after the vendor license. But if you're an acquiring company, you want to understand that in that particular instance, it wasn't a significant risk, but in other types of applications, you can assume that it would be. This becomes increasingly complex as organizations are developing products and services that are using data from a variety of sources. The issues around what constitutes a derivative product, who has copyright, if any, around data, because the intellectual property rights in data is very complex. It's different from software. It depends on the type of data. It depends on how it's used and how it was created in a database. And it frankly depends on the jurisdiction, because some jurisdictions have greater protection around data than others. So understanding all of that is going to be increasingly important. And as I said, when you look at third-party rights, as you've got customers that are using your data, you want to make sure that they are using it in a way that protects your intellectual property rights. You also want to make sure that if you're using what's known as open data, which is similar to open software, or people are scraping data off the website because there's some uncertainty associated with data on website that's posted on a website, and whether if it's publicly available, if you can scrape that off the website, or do you need to get a permission from the website owner. There's just a lot of issues around that need to be considered and addressed, and that's something that many people are not considering, but it's going to be increasingly important because as organizations start to see value in their data, they're going to start thinking about ways that they need to protect it, and that's going to result in litigation as it does in other things. So if you've got a target company that is using data and developing products and services, you want to make sure you understand the flow of that throughout the organization and the contractual obligations from third parties. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on this briefly, a framework for due diligence of data, but as I mentioned, we'll go into more detail at 12:30 on this, and I'll go through each one of these with more specific information. But in considering what due diligence for data in an M&A transaction looks like and what you're considering, I think there are several different considerations. As I said, one is the operational consideration. So you want to go back and understand how data is used and how it's what individuals touch the data, how it's used, what products and services are developed, where they acquire it. If you're in the data privacy world, you're probably familiar with the term of data mapping, which is a concept that if an organization that is collecting personal information needs to map its data so that it knows how it's collected, where it's stored, who has access to it. I think it needs to be more broadly than data privacy, though. I think it needs to be all data that comes into an organization, particularly if it's being used for products and services. So that's the operational consideration. As I mentioned, ownership rights is important. Being able to understand what the intellectual property rights in the data is, both from your vendors and the rights that the target company has, and then also what rights the customers of that target company have, and making sure that they all align is going to be of critical importance, again, as you start to develop product as products and services are increasingly being developed around data. The next is internal policies and procedures. As in any type of due diligence, it's important to understand what policies and procedures that an organization has, and this includes data as well. So this might include policies around data protection. It would also include policies around cybersecurity, and it would also include policies around data quality and assuring that intellectual property rights are protected. And if an organization does not have those in place, it's useful to see what the potential risks are and how difficult it would be to apply the acquirer's policies or developing new policies, because those are going to be important as organizations become more data dependent. Contracts, licenses, agreements, basically anything with third parties. It's important to understand what those obligations are. I mentioned representations and warranties, indemnification language, transfer of intellectual property rights, limitation of liabilities, all the type of language you would expect in all these different types of agreements. And there's a host of agreements that could be implemented or could be affected. So it could be license agreements, it could be contracts, it could be service agreements that include data. It could be cloud storage agreements, it could be software as a service agreements. All of those could potentially have issues associated with data that need to be considered. And it's not just to check the box to make sure that there is agreement in place, but making sure that the terms of those agreements are understood, and as I said, that they align. And then an area that I think is still in flux, but I think it's important to understand is insurance. And some of you may be familiar with cybersecurity data protection insurance, and one of the challenges of getting that type of insurance and the risks and making sure that the risks that are protected against are actually in the insurance policies, because this is still new. This type of insurance is still relatively new. Some of the it's just now the court cases are working their way through in terms of insurance companies that are challenging the applicability of certain provisions. So being aware of what those are and understanding the particular language that the target company has, what exceptions there are, is going to be important. And then also around data quality and liability. If there is a potential for a liability issue associated with data in a product or services, making sure that that's covered in the policy as well, and there's no exclusions from that. And in addition, it's also useful to see what insurance requirements has a target company put on its customers or its data vendors to make sure that that risk has been allocated that way. As I said, I'll go into more detail about this in the next session, but I did want to sort of give a highlight of the different types of issues that should be considered from a framework standpoint. And Mallory, I'm done.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today. If you have any questions for him, please feel free to send him an email or call him at the phone number shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.